Okay, I think we can start. Welcome everyone to this webinar, Just Transitions in Coal Communities, Practical, Political and Financial Perspectives from the EU and Abroad. This event is hosted as part of the New York Climate Week. My name is Andrzej Błachowicz. I represent the Secretariat of the EU Initiative for Coal Regions Transition, and I'm in charge specifically for international collaboration. Just a few words about this event. The purpose of this event is to really showcase the EU experience and experience of the European region with transition away from coal. We have over 5 years experience with that initiative for coal regions. And on the other hand, we also want to establish collaborations with regions, actors, stakeholders in other countries. And that will be a big part of the activity of that initiative over the next 3 years. We have a great panel of speakers. So just to, maybe we can just move to the next slide to show the agenda for today. So we will start with Veronique Marx, who represents the Energy Department of the European Commission, and she will introduce the initiative for coal regions in transition. Then we will hear from Maria, who represents the government of Asturias in Spain, to talk about how Asturias has been managing the transition and also part of the various activities of the initiative. I think Asturias is one of the most active regions in our initiative. Then we'll hear from Natalia, who will talk about the United States and its regional perspective, especially focusing on the Appalachian region. And finally, Abhishek from the Climate Investment Funds will tell us more about their program that is focusing on major economies, on medium-sized economies, but also specifically on financing. Hopefully we'll be done around 9:50 EDT, and then we can jump to questions, comments, and I will specifically ask, on one hand, to provide us obviously questions, to send questions and ask our panelists, but also to pitch collaborations, because that's what we want to establish. So tell us if you're a stakeholder interested in that collaboration, what would you like to hear from European regions and what you can offer to share. A couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded, so later on we'll plan to publish the recording, most likely on the DG Energy of the European Commission on their YouTube channel. They will also share the presentations that will be shown by our panelists. And again, as I said, please pose questions to us using the Q&A function of the Zoom, but you can obviously also use the chat room to share any reflections on any of the subjects that you hear. Okay, so without further ado, let me introduce Veronique Marx, who is a team leader on Just Transition in DG Energy, which is effectively the Energy Department of the European Commission. Before that job, Veronique worked in the Secretariat General of the European Commission, coordinating energy policy. And it's very interesting that before that, she was working on development and demography policies in Nigeria and Vietnam as part of the European Commission, but also earlier as part of the United Nations agency. So Veronique, over to you to introduce us the Coal Regions in Transition initiative.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Well, here it's already afternoon, but nice to meet you. Wait, I'm just sharing my screen so that we can get started with the presentation. Yeah, it's working. Yeah, I hope you can see it. Yeah, so thank you, Andrew, for the introduction. So I will be introducing you very briefly our Coal Regions in Transition initiative. Just to give you a little bit of a background on the situation of coal in the EU. Coal still accounts for about 20% of our total electricity production and employs around 230 people directly in the sector. But it has been in decline for the past decades. If you look at the figures, in 2021, for example, the coal production of hard coal was 57 million tons, whereas a decade earlier, this was still 277 million. And also, the EU reduced consumption of both the hard coal and the brown coal by 1/4 in the past 3 years. The policy context of the just transition actually dates back already for some quite years, and I think there the EU, we were quite the front runner in how we framed and started thinking about just transition. So the early steps were done already as of 2015 onwards, when with the Commission we developed what we call the Clean Energy for All Europeans package, which was a package of various legislative pieces in the energy sector, and which already included a strong element of just transition in those legislative pieces. Based on that was then also the Coal Regions in Transition initiative was introduced, the one that I will be presenting you today. And all this really evolved fast when in 2019 the European Union adopted the European Green Deal as its economic strategy and took a formal commitment to climate neutrality by 2050. Also this year, the European ministers adopted a recommendation, so what we call that the Council recommendation. So basically the ministers recommend to themselves certain policy principles. And so this year they adopted a recommendation on fair transition to climate neutrality, setting out quite precisely recommendation on the social and economic aspects of how the energy transition or how the green transition should work in the EU. Now coming back to our program, so as I mentioned, the initiative really started already in 2017, before we had this commitment to climate neutrality. But since then, other programs have developed, and I just will mention them some to give you a little bit of an understanding on the wider just transition approach in the EU. In terms of funding, it's really important to underline this just transition mechanism that was set up in 2020, which mobilizes around 60 billion euros for the funding period until 2027. It's composed of various funding streams, one which is Just Transition Fund, which is pure grants, but it also has public loan facilities and investment schemes that are grants, but with the aim to generate private and public investments. There's also other funding programs that fund various aspects of the green or the just transition, research and development, or diversification or clean energy technologies. So as regards our initiative, it includes as the scope coal, but also peat and oil shale regions, which for peat we have in Ireland and Finland, and oil shale we only have in Estonia. The rest of the countries covered in the EU are coal regions. And the purpose of the initiative is really to share knowledge and share experiences between the EU regions facing similar issues regarding the green transition, and more specifically the coal phase out. It really aims to bring stakeholders together to exchange and share experience, to develop knowledge between themselves, and to really generate an inclusive process of how these transitions could be happening in the specific regions. It includes various work streams that I will present here. One of the main work streams is, of course, meetings and exchange forum. Every year, there's a number of technical meetings that are prepared. The next one will take place at the end of October in Brussels, and it allows to bring together really various stakeholders from all the spectrum, let's say, of society, NGOs, local and national authorities, to come together in Brussels for 1 or 2 days to debate on various issues. We also develop a wide range of knowledge products, studies, webinars, and toolkits touching on specific issues related to the just transition. There's a large technical assistance facility. The last one that took place in 2020 and 2021 included 7 regions, including Asturias, and maybe Maria will explain us a little bit more about that. And there also, I just want to highlight the next call will be starting now in October 2022. Then there's another technical assistance facility, which is called Target, and it's provided by the European Investment Bank. And it supports regions in the identification and preparation of investment projects. And then lastly, another program which is relatively new under initiative is the Exchange EU program, which sets up peer-to-peer encounters between the regions with the goal to establish connections between these regions and to allow for knowledge exchange. Here you see a little bit of map of the exchanges that were set up in the last call. And there also another second call will be launched next month. So what are the recent activities that have been done on the activity under the initiative? So this EU exchange program, as I just mentioned before, it really allows a direct peer-to-peer contact between stakeholders, whereby stakeholders of one region visit the other region and spend several days in workshops and site visits to discuss specific issues. We have also boosted the technical assistance component for both the component that I mentioned before, the one where the call will be launched the next call will be launched next month, and the one implemented by the European Investment Bank. We have put much more emphasis now also on international outreach and exchange, of which this event is also taking place, and as Andrew has explained before, really about being able to share this experience with regions or stakeholders outside of the EU, so that we can learn from those regions on how they have embarked on the just transition, but also that we can share our experience that we have in the EU. And then also in 2020, we launched a sister initiative of the same initiative for the regions in the Western Balkans and the Ukraine. This is it from me as an introduction to this event. Here you find the links for any further information that you might be looking for. But of course, I'm also available for further questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronique. Just to say to all the participants, there were some black blocks appearing in parts of your presentation. So, but we will share the slides thereafter. I think that it will be in good shape. So thank you very much. And maybe just also to add to the final slide that the event in Brussels, you can attend in person, but you can also join online. So it will be a mixed mode event, hybrid event rather. Okay, Veronique, thank you so much. As I propose, we just continue with our speakers, and then I encourage people to put questions in Q&A and comment in the chat function, and then we try to have a conversation, a bit like informally a panel after that, where you can pose questions to various panelists and maybe even cross-jurisdictional ones. Okay, thank you very much. The next speaker, Maria Belarmina Diaz-Aguado. Maria is a Director General for Energy, Mining and Repurposing in the government of Asturias in Spain. She has worked there for more than 5 years, and before she was a professor of mining exploitation at the University of Oviedo. So both a politician and expert. Great to have you, Maria, and yeah, just a personal pleasure to be able to have worked with you for so many years. Over to you, and we are very keen to hear the Asturias case.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and good morning to the States and good afternoon to the people in Europe. I'm going to try to explain a bit of the transition away from coal in Asturias, but to understand the transition, I think it's very important to remember who we are. I always like to remember we are miners. We are also workers of energy sector and of industry, and this is very important because we have 3 different impacts of the transition in Asturias. The closure of coal mines in recent times, the closure of coal power plants. When comparing these figures with those of Veronique, you can see that almost 50% of the installed power in the region was coal and gas, and 73% of the energy came from coal and gas, and most of these coal plants are closed or are even dismantling in the next years. And also we have a very intensive industry with high energy consumption. 20% of the GDP comes from the industry, and 69% of the consumption of energy is due to industry too. And also we have high emissions in sectors which are very hard to abate. So this is a very specific transition. And in what moment, when? Well, I say this is the perfect storm. We knew we had climate change there. We knew climate action was urgent, but we never expected a coronavirus pandemic, or we never expected a war in Ukraine, a war with problems also of security of supply and of increasing energy prices. So this is a very complicated scenario for the transition we are affording. What can we do for this? To work very hard at 4 different levels. I try to explain the institutional level, the strategic level. We have been working in identification of projects too, and in funding mechanisms, because we think there is available funding, and we must make a very efficient and successful use of this European funding, the structural funding, the next generation, and also the Just Transition Fund and the Just Transition mechanism that Veronique was explaining before. Where is this institutional work? I'm going to explain a bit of each of these taking place. Well, I would say the institutional work takes place everywhere. In Europe, of course, here today in New York, and also at Asturian level. The most important event we had in this area was the Initiative for Coal Regions in Transition with the annual political dialogue, which took place in July. You can see a picture over there of this event. We involved young people as part of the transition because we really think they are very important for this transition. And also we involved many companies, showing that the region has this commitment. From UNOSA, which is the state-owned company, to EDP, which is an energy company, or for example, manufacturers of components of the renewable energy sector, such as IDESA. And this means that the whole region wants to change and go towards this energy and green transition. The second part is how are we doing this at the strategic level? And I think that these pictures in the left, which are the results and conclusions for this event in July, are very nice and explain what we had been already working strategically. All the regions agreed that the future of energy and energy security is very important in this transition, that we have to put in value the manufacturing and value chains of our regions, and also we have to involve people, communities, and all the sector, or this whole society in this transition. This is very important. And for this, I want to show these pictures over there, showing the potential of the regions. In our case, for example, the offshore components, and also the potential of the industries already installed in the regions, that with their contribution to decarbonization and their commitment with the regions are very important in this transition. If we talk about the how to, it's very important, the support of the European Union. Nothing could have been done or could be done without this support. Not only economic support, but also technical support. And in this sense, I want to explain the START program. The platform of co-regions in transition gave us this assistance, as Veronique was saying, through the Secretariat, and they helped to make the analysis of the relevant socioeconomic and industrial context of the region. We had never made a strategy before. It was the first one, and we made 3 out of this assistance. So I think this was really important for us. An energy strategy to 2030 with a path of decarbonization to 2050. They help to all the logic and structure. They help us to develop templates for the projects we were collecting. And from this, we obtained a just transition energy strategy for Asturias, which was the basis for a just transition plan we sent to Brussels in June, and which is necessary for the Just Transition Fund. So you can see this was a very interesting and intensive work. And also we made another strategy, which was a strategy on raw materials after these works. So none at the beginning and 3 at the end of the works. We are also working in the Exchange European program, and we'll have the first meeting in October with the city of Bytom. And if we can say that we are proud of something, I would say it's the social dialogue. We succeeded in getting the participation of the Asturian society as a whole, 16 departments of the government, companies, associations, trade unions, university, research centers in various working groups. And this was really very important for us because it has been a very hard work, but we think the result was pretty good. And why are we doing all this? I would say that first of all, because we believe that it's necessary, as I was saying, there is an urgency in climate action, but also because we want to fulfill and to be committed with all the objectives and all the politics of the European Union and also of our government. And in third place, we are doing this because we think that it's a challenge, a risk, but also an opportunity. Transition is a driving force for reactivation. And we know what we want to do in this. We want a digital Asturias, a green Asturias, a renewable Asturias. And we think that the path to achieve this is this transition we are talking about now. And what is the transition? Well, this is the third part of my presentation today, the identification of projects. We've been working for these 5 years also in identifying projects in many working groups, in many roundtables with the companies and with the different stakeholders involved in the region. And we have identified as many as 115 projects for as much as 13,800 million euros in renewable energies, in decarbonization, energy storage, circular economy, sustainable mining, sustainable mobility, energy efficiency, or in green hydrogen, which is also very important for us. Some of these projects won't need support, but some do need support because there are still not very mature technologies or technologies being developed. And in this sense, I would just try to talk about the hydrogen for Asturias. And you might think that this slide is a bit too dense, it's a bit too big, but that's what I want to show specifically, that we have a lot in hydrogen. We have 2 huge projects, the Hydil España, which is the largest integrated renewable and competitive hydrogen hub. It's led by ArcelorMittal, but also with Fertiberia, and it's 8,000 million of estimated investment for 7.4 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity in different regions of Spain, as much as 330,000 tons per year of hydrogen. And another project which has been developed by the region, which is called Recode, is a change in our DNA, it's a change in Asturias, hydrogen for reactivation, competitiveness, and decarbonization with a full ecosystem of production, transport, distribution, and use in different sectors. 25 initiatives for 2,400 million and for over 1.4 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity. It's a good news that yesterday it was one of the projects, EDP Green Hydrogen Valley, was selected as an IPSAI, which is a project of common interest for Europe, and it's liable of receiving funding from the European Commission. And this is very good news for us, as I'm saying. And how much, because the funding is a very important part, how much do we have for this? Well, we have the support of different funding programs of the national government with priority for councils in just transition, with points or extra points or intensity, aid intensity for these councils. And also we have the budget directly managed for our department, for our direction, which is a lot. We have 213 million euros from different budget coming from Brussels, from the Next Generation Fund, or from the national budget, mainly in energy efficiency and mining reclamation. We have almost 39 million euros of regional budget, which is a lot for such a small region as Asturias. And this is for 22 and 23, which is a lot of money, as I'm saying. And now we are developing, almost ready to develop the Just Transition Fund, which is 263 million for Asturias. So we are talking of almost 550 million for Asturias, for the region. And according to our calculation, for each euro of funding, we get 4 to 5 euros of investment. So we would be talking about 2,000 million euros of investment thanks to this funding. We think it's a great opportunity. We have to be ready for it and do it as well as possible, because we think that this is really the green transition in the green paradise. Asturias, we always say it's a green paradise that I invite you to visit in this transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria. So yeah, I think that has given all our speakers from outside the EU a good perspective of how the program is set up and how you can really benefit. And I mean, I love this, which you said, 3 strategies of the technical assistant. I mean, that's what we always look for, testimonies of how various support programs are successful and can work. So thank you very much, Maria, and also thank you for your passion. Now, the third speaker, and this is obviously part of the niche that I think we want to fill in the coming months and years, which is the collaboration, right? Collaboration, and obviously the circumstances and the governance structure of EU and US are very different, But I think there are many, many interesting examples of actions, initiatives, and challenges and solutions between the EU and US. So this is an attempt to bring those together. And we have great pleasure to have Natalia Rudiak, who is a special projects director at something that is called Reimagine Appalachia, which is essentially a broad coalition of individuals and organizations, including the local authorities in the Appalachia region, which basically covers 4 states: West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky. Natalia is a social change agent, and it's very interesting that you also have in your previous, one of your previous jobs was to be a city legislator for the city of Pittsburgh. So I think that kind of understanding of the action on the ground and the sort of policy making is very interesting. So thanks very much for joining us, and yeah, we are looking forward to your contribution.
Thank you, Andre. It's really great to be here with you all. And yes, I have been an elected legislator. I also do work with a Polish NGO as a policy advisor, so familiar with many of the issues in the EU and abroad. And so I'm really thrilled to be here together and to weave all of our stories together so we can move forward to a brighter future and a healthier planet. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right, so what I am sharing with you is an extremely long presentation, which I will not go through, but hopefully this will be sent out. And there are just so many links and updates and videos of all the cool stuff we have going on. So yes, we are Reimagine Appalachia. And this is one of our videos, which I will not play, but it will make you cry. Oh, it's starting to play. All right, some great video of Appalachia. And yes, we are a coalition of 100 organizations, that is environmental organizations, labor unions, racial justice organizations, grassroots organizations, and over 140 elected officials and faith leaders. And we were, again, born out of a broad recognition that the economy has not been working for us, specifically in the upper Appalachian region. I'll show you a quick map soon in the states of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, and also we do some work in Kentucky. So we came together to find common ground and build an economy that's good for workers, communities, and the environment. So this is for context for folks who may not be familiar with the US region of Appalachia. It's a large mountain chain, and you can see here again the states that we work in: Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. The red here are the economic distress levels of these counties. And you can see the counties with the most economic distress seem to align with the counties that have had a reliance on extractive industries, including coal. So we say that we have a resource curse, providing raw materials for the prosperity of the nation, which has many parallels in many global contexts historically and today. So we were left in poverty. Our workers have been exploited with things like black lung and other illnesses. Our land is polluted, and many of us have been left sick. So our goal has been to create a plan for Appalachia, really prioritizing good jobs. The way that we can push this narrative and get people together in our communities is really talking about good jobs and making sure that we give poll workers a priority. And we can do this through things like repairing the damage of our polluted lands and modernizing the grid, et cetera. So this is the plan that we put together with researchers from across our states, with input from all the stakeholders across our states. And you can see that we categorized these investments that will both benefit our communities and create jobs. And we did some really specific analysis of how much investment it would need annually to reach goals within these categories and how many jobs could be created through these areas. So 2020 is when we developed this blueprint. We call it the Appalachian Climate Infrastructure Plan. And it was really developed, we actually got together before the very instant turning point of election in 2020. And I will also say that one of the reasons that we very specifically got together, and again, I'm sure there are some parallels here in other parts of the world, is that the conversations around climate change and climate investment were driven in the United States by the heavily populated areas of the East and West Coast, where also, let's just say, the shades of politics were different than the way that our residents chose to vote. We are a nonpartisan organization, so that's all I'll say. But we really wanted to make sure that our priorities were included. Again, things like expanding broadband and extending sustainable manufacturing and things like that. We wanted to do it our way. So we did a massive lobbying campaign for federal legislation. Because we did not have the version of the European Green New Deal that you all have now. So we were pushing for our own. Interestingly enough, what started as the Green New Deal turned into the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is a $1.2 trillion bill, which I don't even think our minds can comprehend that number, which was signed into law last November. And then this year, again, I think you can see some interesting quirks of American politics where the Green New Deal turned into the rhetorical device of the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a $400 billion investment in climate. And so many of our priorities were funded in the bill because of the major pushes that we did with our federal legislators, and also legislators and caucuses across the nation, collaborating with even other coal and transition areas within the country. And we also really made sure that community and labor standards were included in the agency's guidance for spending down this funding. And also, I'm going to need somebody to give me a time warning if I am to go off. There's so much here. So as we say, all politics is local, but also all infrastructure is local. So given my background, I also worked with many local governments across our region to demand federal action, as it is our local governments that really see the devastating impact of these weather events and aging infrastructure, declining tax bases, et cetera. So in the United States, there is, how do I put this? Everything rolls downhill. So we have to deal with a lot of the things that, for example, maybe state and federal policy where there's gaps in, but unfortunately we often aren't given the resources to do that. And so we, again, are uniquely positioned to lobby the federal government and also to understand that these problems are bigger than our municipal borders. So we have elected officials behind us. Again, we really emphasize jobs as our path to across this transition. Yes, we really value community and labor benefits. So we've done research around this and again, really worked closely with our federal agencies to make sure that there are good wages and healthcare and retirement benefits within these jobs, that there are career pathways for traditionally excluded people such as women, Black, Indigenous, and other workers of color, and that we're building local wealth and wealth that isn't owned or siphoned off by corporations that may be located elsewhere. Let's see. Yes, and to that end, we value apprenticeship and pre-apprenticeship programs. It's almost become, I hate to say it, but it's almost become cliche to say, oh, well, we're not going from mining to coding, right? We don't want to train folks there's a phrase called train and pray. We don't want to train and pray and train workers and pray that there's a job for them at the end of the road. We want to train and work. So within all the areas that I mentioned, from reclaiming abandoned mine lands to repurposing shuttered coal plants and sustainable manufacturing, we want to work with the labor unions to ensure that there are pathways to careers and jobs that are already being created through these massive federal investments. Again, we've worked really closely with federal agencies. We've done a lot of work with the Department of Interior, the Biden-Harris administration. We've worked to host a summit with the White House. And we're really proud of our work with the Inflation Reduction Act. And this is just a summary of many of the investments that are included here in the Inflation Reduction Act. These are the teams that we have. Again, we are a coalition. So there's just a small core of us that manage a lot of this work. But if you look at all of these teams, again, from manufacturing to broadband to transportation, to repairing the damage, like plugging abandoned oil wells or repairing the damage from abandoned mine lands, we have partners in this work. So sustainable manufacturing, we have about 20 plus partners, and we meet every couple of weeks to figure out what do we want to make in Appalachia? Where, you know, when I heard all of the projects, for example, that are being discussed in Asturias, right? We're kind of on that path now to determine what projects we could look at and consider. So I actually have an overview of every single one of these teams, but I am not going to go through that. You can go through it yourself or check out our website. It's a lot of information. But what I do want to say as I finish up here, and this is something that I talk about with my colleagues often. And again, I'm sure that there is somewhat similarity between the EU and perhaps other regions, but particularly in the US, we have all of these federal investments coming down the pike, all of these billions of dollars. One of the issues that we have is that it's all very competitive. And so in a region like Appalachia, which has been historically underinvested in, we don't have the capacity in the non-governmental organizations or the philanthropic funding, or even in terms of local governments, right? We've just had decimated tax bases, and many of our local governments don't even have a complete staff to be able to write grants. And so again, a lot of this federal funding requires writing grants and gaining partners and showing how competitive you are and why this project should be funded. And so we are currently trying to figure out the gaps in capacity for technical assistance as we move forward. So we're kind of trying to build the plane as we fly it. And the other issue that we have is that the state policies, for example, between Pennsylvania and West Virginia and Kentucky and Ohio, they each have their own state agencies. So when we look at broadband, we may have national labor unions, but these labor unions have sub-organizations within the states, and each state has their own rules and agencies. And so we have to do everything and create really complicated spreadsheets many, many times over to try to work with local stakeholders to see how we can implement these things. So between the NGOs and the philanthropies and the federal agencies and the labor unions, it can be a challenge to try to work across those different communities or stakeholders. And so, again, I see our communities as having so much in common with yours. And in some ways, maybe our communities having more in common with some of your communities than even with communities within the United States. So it's very important that we keep up this collaboration and learn from each other. We have some really interesting things going on where we're trying to figure out how to repurpose shuttered coal plants. We're doing a lot of work around that and figuring out how to turn coal plants into eco-industrial parks, making the technology of the future. And so we do a combination of research and technical assistance and bringing folks together. You can see we have faith outreach, the Black Appalachian Coalition. So we're grassroots, we're business, we're labor, we're the environment. And yes, we're excited to see how we can leverage this funding going forward and these partnerships going forward. Thank you so much.
Perfect, Natalia. Thank you very much for this again passionate presentation. And I think this is great that we manage to have all the people who really care. It's not only your job, but I think it's also your life passion. So while we're moving to the next speaker, you may want to see the chat. Somebody's asking about more details about Rejoin. So maybe there's a link that you could just post there to answer that. There are also a couple of questions that we've received. So please put more questions that we will address in the concluding panel. But then let me move to our final speaker, Abhishek Bhaskar, who is a senior energy specialist and lead of the Accelerating Coal Transitions Investment Program at Climate Investment Funds, with more than a decade experience with clean energy and climate finance. And this is the kind of completion of our geographical reach for this. So it's not only that you will focus about how to finance a transition from coal to clean, but also, from my understanding, you guys are working on countries like South Africa, India, Indonesia, and Philippines. So any reflections you share, that would hugely complement our discussion. So Abhishek, over to you.
Thank you, Andre. And thank you for having me on this panel. It's very rich discussion so far. So let me add a few cents on the financing side of things. Thank you. My name is Abhishek Bhaskar, and I lead the Accelerating Coal Transition or the ACT investment program at the Climate Investment Funds. Over the next few minutes, I will provide a brief summary of the ACT program, which is one of the world's first dedicated investment platforms to address a just and inclusive energy transition away from coal in key developing countries. But let me start with a quick background of who we are. Next slide, please. Thanks. For almost a decade and a half, we have been a leading multilateral climate fund working exclusively with multilateral development banks, or MDBs, as you may know them, in areas of clean energy, sustainable transport, resilience, and forestry. So we have a funding envelope of over $10 billion, where we have supported over 300 projects using what we call as country investment plans. Our business model has some of the following key features. Like I mentioned, we are a multi-MDB co-financing platform, which means that we work exclusively with 6 MDBs. These include the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, EBRD, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank Group, including IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank. I mentioned we already follow a country-led programmatic approach where client countries put together an investment plan to reflect their sectoral priorities. So you pick energy, forestry, or resilience. They identify what are the key priority areas that they want to focus in the coming period of time. And that's the package that we then support through concessional financing. Like I said, what we offer is large-scale, predictable concessional resources at scale to our client countries. What we mean by concessional is these are loan financing that come at very attractive rates, including very long tenors, very low interest rates, and are often used as risk capital to address critical barriers that help scale up certain technologies. And finally, social inclusion is a key design consideration from the onset of these investment plans and the projects that are underlying these investment plans once they get to the implementation stage. Next slide, please. Thanks. So over the past couple of years, we spent time putting together a dedicated mechanism to support a just and inclusive transition away from coal. And for us, the rationale was quite compelling and based on a strong demand from the ground through our partner countries as well as the partner MDBs. We started with the fact that coal carries significant climate, environmental, and health costs. It is the single largest source of global temperature increase, responsible for a quarter of the 1 degree centigrade increase in global temperatures above pre-industrial levels. Of course, we know that air pollution causes millions of deaths annually. Last time I checked the figure, it was close to 4 million per year due to heart, lung, and other respiratory diseases. So just to say that coal is not cheap, as it carries significant direct and indirect costs. Second, we know that renewable energy has eroded the commercial viability of coal, especially in older, inefficient plants, thereby increasing the share of uncompetitive coal plants globally. The cheap renewables and energy storage solutions are making countries look for look closely at their existing and planned coal assets, their energy infrastructure plans, and looking at it from the point of cost savings to the customers, but also from the point of view of potential climate, public health, and environmental benefits that it brings to its citizens. So coal is not economical either if you consider some of these considerations. Third, we know that coal regions, as speakers before me mentioned, in Asturias, Appalachians, or elsewhere, coal regions are typically mono-industry towns with strong dependencies on coal assets. So for example, in India alone, over 3 million people are estimated to be directly or indirectly employed in the coal mining sector. There's a state called Jharkhand in India, where coal employs 1/10 of the region's workforce, either directly or indirectly, and contributes to government revenues and funding of basic infrastructure like schools, hospitals, roads, etc., etc. The Indian Railways, which is the highest railway passenger volume in the world, derives 40% of its freight revenues from coal. And those revenues are then used to subsidize fare for the poorest of the passengers. So all of these considerations, this is just India, and you have many such examples, South Africa, Indonesia, and so on. So this adds a strong people dimension to the transition, making it socially, economically, and hence politically a very complex challenge. And finally, as we have seen in the States or elsewhere in the developed world, fewer jobs exist in coal today than before, making it an industry of the past. And on the other hand, job growth in a clean energy economy is estimated to be greater than job losses in fossil fuels in the short term. So coal is not where the jobs of the future are necessarily sitting. So all of these considerations, among others, led us to design a dedicated investment mechanism that offers a holistic and flexible toolkit using concessional resources to mobilize private sector and address 3 critical challenges associated with governance, people, and infrastructure as they pertain to coal transition. Next slide, please. So here's the broad scope of the program. It's important to provide at the start of the process a very clear signal to identify the relevant institutions, the stakeholders, and decision-making structures at all levels, local, regional, and so on, to ensure a well-coordinated implementation strategy moving into a transition roadmap. So under Pillar 1, talks about governance, we offer funding for activities such as development of a transformation strategy, an economic and social development plan, a communication strategy, and so on and so forth, in close consultation with all the key stakeholders affected by the transition. Under Pillar 2, it forms an integral part of the program and talks to the just element of the transition. It offers holistic approaches to address economic challenges faced by those most affected by the transition. So under this pillar, we offer funding not only for social support activities such as reskilling, retraining, to help people retain jobs or prepare for new jobs, but also for investments in climate smart activities in the region that can help create alternative income generation opportunities for the communities. And finally, the third pillar, which is the core of our program, we seek to mobilize private sector and others like philanthropies and so on to facilitate coal phase down and accelerate clean energy deployment through decommissioning and repurposing of existing coal assets. So both on the power plant side as well as on the mining side. And for this, we support options, a range of options, renewable energy plus storage, for example, land use change like forestry and so on, or other activities, depending on the site-specific considerations. As you know, they play a key role in the selection of the potential repurposing option on a site. Next slide, please. Now, here, let me spend a few moments on the just element or focus of the program. Like I mentioned earlier, we consider this as a central piece of the program and have earmarked dedicated funding to ensure there is strong emphasis on the communities affected most by the transition. Broadly speaking, funding is offered in areas that could be classified as planning, preparing, and provisioning. Under planning, we support development of socioeconomic assessments, just transition strategies, communication plan, among others. As part of preparing the communities for future jobs, we offer support for education, skills development, retraining, reskilling, and so on. And then finally, we also support provisioning for private sector engagement that can support economic diversification of these areas that can then create alternative income generation opportunities. And we do this through CapEx investments in relevant activities. So as you can see, we complete the whole circle where we not just start with the planning, but also put dedicated investments to create those economic activities that can then employ the communities in the area that stand to be most affected by the transition. Next slide, please. So like I stressed earlier, the rationale for a dedicated program like ACT is very strong. In our 15 or so years of experience, we think that a holistic approach that is backed by concessional resources, especially given that we worked in developing countries with multilateral development banks at the center of this process, is expected to play a catalytic role. The MDBs, they bring a wealth of experience. They have long-standing relationships and engagement in these countries. So we bring to bear all of that and hence have an impact and play a very catalytic role in each of these countries that we engage in. We expect that the program will raise ambition. We think that the pace of transitioning away from coal is not fast enough to meet the goals. So we need a dedicated focus and not wait for markets to kick in and have an impact on some of these coal assets. We think that, as you can imagine, it is one of its kind, as no similar initiative exists for developing countries in Asia and Africa, where we are operating at present times. And this is especially relevant right now as we look at the multiple crises that we are facing, that puts competing pressures on the limited public resources we have. So it's a one of its kind program that we are looking to implement here. And finally, we think that, it's hopefully at the end of it, once we have supported activities and we have experience down the lane of implementing these activities, it will throw up a number of lessons by us experimenting with different modalities, different models that we can test in these countries. And those lessons will inform transition strategies of both developing as well as developed countries. So we think that it will have a very powerful demonstration effect once we have gone through a cycle of implementation of the program. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. So under this program, we issued an expression of interest, and based on coal dependency of countries, they put forward their applications. And through an assessment by an independent group of experts, we identified 4 countries to be supported through the initial phase of the program. These are India, Indonesia, the Philippines, and South Africa. And the program has quickly, by virtue of its scope and focus on coal transition, on people, and supporting the repurposing or decommissioning and repurposing of existing assets to alternative productive uses, it has become central to various coal transition initiatives. You must have heard of the Just Energy Transition Partnership in South Africa that was announced at COP26 last year. Indonesia is working on a country platform to support its own coal phase out that it is likely to announce at G20. And for all of these initiatives, each of these initiatives, ACT plays a central role in not just through the scope of the work and the funding that it is able to mobilize through concessional resources, but also by virtue of the ability to mobilize additional sources of financing using those limited concessional resources. So the catalytic role, the leveraging, the mobilization potential is pretty significant if you look at the role of ACT. Just to give an example, typically our investments have mobilized almost $8 to $10 for every dollar in concessional resources. So if you have put in 100 million, funds from MDBs, private sector, bilaterals, and other DFIs, and so on and so forth, have mobilized almost $800 million to $1 billion for every 100 million in resources. So if we assume the $2.5 billion of ACT funding that we have right now to be programmed over the coming years, then you're looking at a very significant mobilization potential in this area. And if you consider that these are some of the most coal-dependent areas, you look at India, Indonesia, South Africa, then you're looking at a potential scale of impact that is unmatched. Of course, we'll need to see how the implementation progresses, but it is very promising in terms of what it's trying to accomplish and what it can potentially mobilize using a number of actors. The 4 countries that I mentioned, they're currently in the process of putting together an investment plan, like I mentioned up top. And in the coming years, we are looking forward to implementing those investment plan and see how the program fares as we move along. So with this, I believe my 8 minutes is over, so I'll stop, but happy to take any questions that may be around. Thank you. Over to you, Andre.
Thanks very much, Abhishek. And I understand from our earlier discussion that you have to leave in around 5 minutes. So that's why I will just focus on one question that was specifically to you, and maybe I'll let you answer this, and then later on I'll just try to group questions so that we can have a bit of a conversation among the remaining 2 panelists. So Abhishek, one question was about sort of how much of your investment is demand driven. How do you make sure that this is not the sort of, you know, the big global institutions kind of throwing money? But I'm adding my interpretation of the question. The question is more really, how do you ensure the demand driven, that it addresses the local needs of the communities?
Sure, I'm happy to take that question. It's an important question, and it's a central feature of our business model. So the way we operate is that the countries, the investment plan that I was referring to, the countries who are once selected, they are invited to put together an investment plan. The investment plan is essentially, it translates the priorities of the country. So let's take coal, for example. So South Africa was selected as one of the countries. So South Africa, the country, the government of South Africa, having been selected, goes back to the drawing board as it puts together an investment plan. And based on its priorities in the region, on these areas that ACT supports, so on priorities around governance or policy and institutional reforms, priorities around just transition in Mpumalanga, for example, in South Africa, priorities around coal transition involving Eskom, for example, in terms of repurposing, decommissioning of its coal assets. So it goes back to its stakeholders, and in consultation, it's a country-led, country-owned process, the investment plan development process. And so it goes back to its stakeholders, involves them into discussion and conversations based on which it puts together this investment plan and then presents to my board for approval. And so it reflects the demand from the country rather than us saying you put your money here, there, and there, or any of the financial institutions saying this is a pipeline that we would like to support and this is where you put the money. Instead, it comes organically from the ground, from the countries themselves, and that's been a central feature of our business model. That's how we ensure that it is demand driven and in response to countries' priorities.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Abhishek. Thanks very much for being with us. And yeah, we just pass, if there is anything else that emerges, we'll pass it on after.
Thanks.
Thank you all. And I want to thank all of you for sticking to the time, because we have a proper half an hour now for exchange and discussion. So what I will do is basically some questions were posted in writing, and then I reached out to our panelists to respond to them. So all of you can see some questions already with responses in the Q&A section, but I'm going to, not everybody is reading during the seminar, and not everybody has access to the Q&A. So what I will do, I will just try to select some of the most important themes from those questions, and then allow the 3 of you to sort of reflect on that. So one interesting issue here was, of course, the question about energy crisis and the war in Ukraine. How this has changed the ambition, and how this has changed sort of what the EU is doing with its regions. So Veronica, I know you responded, but then I'll give you obviously a chance to maybe elaborate on that here. The big few questions were basically about the relationship between the federal, national, in this case will be EU level, and the regional and local level, and how, for instance, I think some sort of party affiliation, which I think in the US is especially prominent, right? Whether the sort of Republican governor would do this. And so maybe you can, Natalia, tell us a little bit more about that. And there was also this kind of question to Maria, which is how do you build consensus among actors who are negatively impacted? Because of course you presented a very positive picture, but I guess could you tell us more about some hiccups and problems on the way that you've been experiencing? And I think, yeah, we start with that. So maybe I don't know, maybe Veronique and then Natalia and then Maria pick up on whatever you would like from those questions, and we see how the conversation goes.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So I will just reply to the question on Ukraine. Of course, I already put it in the chat. Of course, in the EU, I mean, we are very, we have big solidarity for Ukraine, but are of course also impacted on our security of supply by the war, and increasingly so as we are approaching winter and Russia has cut off the gas that flows into the EU. And so in that respect, of course, we have seen some increase in the use of coal to produce electricity, as there is no gas to produce the electricity, so it has to be replaced by coal. Nevertheless, EU member states, they are bound by law to climate neutrality, but also to their climate and energy targets by 2030. And so until now, no EU member state has backtracked on these commitments and are still fully engaged to meet those commitments. So we see this temporary increase of coal really as a temporary measure now to get us through the winter. And hopefully after that, we will have increased also already our renewable energy production so that coal does not need to be used. Also economically, of course, coal is much more expensive than renewable energy production. So in that way, as I said, we see this really as more of a short-term measure and does not affect the longer-term 2030 targets that the EU countries have already taken on. And do you want me to go on to one of the other questions, or?
Yeah, please, if you, yeah.
I mean, there was just one on the regional and national level, let's say, synergies in terms of coal phase-out or just transition. I mean, in the EU, of course, we have already quite an established governance setup for everything related to climate and energy targets. In relation to what I said before, this kind of by law, these legal targets that member states have committed to, they had to prepare plans that are made at national level to set out the pathway on how they can reach these targets by 2030. And so there, of course, these are, let's say, large documents which include various elements, of course, also just transition elements, energy poverty elements, and other elements related to the just transition. And these are done at national level, but of course, normally in a participatory manner, so that also regional and local, let's say, elements flow into these plans. But then for some of the funds that I mentioned before, especially the just transition funds, it's regions that are eligible for the funding. And if they want to be eligible for the funding, they have to set out what we call a territorial just transition plan, in which they also set out their strategy towards the just transition for the next years to come, and how they want to use the funds. And so normally these two plans should be in line and in sync. Of course, it's not always perfect, but overall we have seen that there is no conflict or no synergy on these things. I mean, even though some of the plans are regional level and the other ones are at national level, but normally they should be aligned, and they are aligned. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. Natalia, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. Goodness. So we do not have climate plans at the state level. That is, it has not been federal policy, or there's not been federal guidance enforcing states or creating legislation that states must have climate action plans. Many of our state legislatures and governors are resistant to climate action planning, and this is actually in opposition to public opinion. And that's another hour on US democracy, but a lot of it is due to partisan gerrymandering, and the political atmosphere in some of our states can be downright hostile. So this is my take, that the local government to federal policy pipeline, where possible, can actually be more useful. And because because the funding can just go back and forth without having to go through state agencies. Someone had brought up a question in the chat about our work with states and how that's been so far. It's been ad hoc thus far. And one example, though, that we have where we're actually trying to work on two examples, specifically with labor unions. So as labor unions try to bid on some of this funding to do things like environmental remediation or build out broadband access, they have to navigate the complex regulations that state agencies put out. And so right now, for example, we're trying to work with the Ohio Department of Environmental Protection, so we can actually look at how they have their bidding process, so some of our partners can bid on them. So it's really, really complicated, but to the extent that we can build capacity within local communities to directly bid on federal projects, that's exciting.
And there's actually one other thing that I picked up, which I think is really interesting, and Veronique, what you presented, and Natalia, some questions about is financing, right? Is that about how much of this eventually will become fundable through commercial projects, right? And Abhishek was also mentioning that, which I think is powerful, right? And in the just transition mechanism, I think large of them, I mean, some money is sort of direct money that will go to the regions, but I think some of the money is meant to sort of leverage more private financing as a sort of normal business, right? And I think that's what we are, and I think US is, in our perception in Europe, US is always about doing business and making money and stuff like that. But of course, here you're saying that you probably are missing that seed money, right? Initially to kickstart some of this, right? You're muted.
Yes, and I'm not sure if I can put a link in the chat if everybody can see it. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to put a link in the chat as soon as I can find it. We have, and again, what you see in the United States is just a lot of coalitions that we have to leverage each other's strengths to, again, apply for some of this competitive funding. And I keep saying competitive funding because in the United States, the federal government is very reluctant to put out, quote unquote, more government programs. And so unfortunately, we have to do this really complicated dance to develop coalitions to leverage each other's strengths and money and capacity for these projects. But we have an organization called the Coalfield Development Corporation that developed a coalition called the Appalachian Climate Coalition with businesses, with, again, unions, with solar companies. They have over 200 private sector partners where they have employer commitments that they will employ people that will be trained in this field. It's a really, really exciting thing. They just won a $63 million award from the federal government. Again, a local regional coalition getting funding directly from the federal government for this project. So I will put that in here. And yes, private partners are really, really important, particularly as we move forward in things like sustainable manufacturing.
Super, thank you. Maria, what's your take on? Sorry, Veronique, was it in direct response or you just, yeah,
no,
later?
I'll try to explain a bit, yes. If we talk about governance with the at European level or national level, I think it's easier because at European level, you had the governance, as Veronique was saying already. So you had also nice tools such as the platform, the coal platform or just transition platform. So it's easy to make this governance at European level. And at national level, we have the support of the national government too, which is very committed with just transition, and even they have an institute for just transition. But when it comes to the stakeholders who are negatively affected by the transition, as somebody was asking in the chat, this is really different and hard. I know I tried to give a positive idea on this, but I have to say that this is scary at the very beginning. And also it's very difficult to, people doesn't believe anymore. There is the unbelief in the councils and you have to try to engage people again. And this is even more difficult than before the transition began. And if we add also in the equation that we didn't know how to do that, because we were a very strong region with coal mines, with coal plants, and with a very strong industry. So things are changing a lot, and you have to find new tools for new times. And this is really also very difficult. So what we did was like working at very different levels. First of all, in working groups where we try to engage the mayors, the local administrations, and the unions and the companies. And that was very important for us because the documents that came out had already the support of many stakeholders which were negatively affected by the transition themselves. After that, all these documents have been public. They were in public information for weeks, and they could receive the comments, the observations, the amendments of the whole society. Whoever wanted to say something could say that at that moment. And this was really scary again. Everybody could say something about your documents. So it was kind of difficult to see how this was going to work. We also made many events with mayors and with companies to inform and try to let them know what was going on and what the tools and funding opportunities are for them and for their transition. And also when I say that we collect projects, it doesn't mean that we identify the projects themselves, but we make working groups and we try to see what the companies want to do. We try to see what the councils want to do. So the strategy is built listening to people, and it's from bottom to top. I mean, a bottom-up strategy. That's what we're trying to build also. And finally, we have to visit the territory. I always tell my team, we have to step out of the office and visit them and talk to them and see what they want and what they need. So in the very long run, it's a work of listening and try not to be as scared as we were at the beginning, but trying to open our mind. And this last experience, visiting the territory, has probably been the most interesting and enriching one. We are making a reclamation of 83 million euros in 3 different mines in the southwest of the region. And we visited the territory many times. We talked to the neighbors, and we tried to introduce in the reclamation project what the neighbors wanted for their area, because it's very important to give them what they want. And sometimes it's really not much money compared to the big amount of the reclamation itself. But the idea is that they find that this is also part of them, and they have there what they want to have for the future. It's their future too. So I think it's a very long way made of different pieces that have to be settled in all together. And still we are learning, because we had to learn a lot during the process, and we're still learning, and we are trying to listen to people. I think that's the key for it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, and I think, yeah, Spain is, or Asturias and Spain in general, I think is quite it's a very nice example of collaboration on so many levels, and utilizing all the opportunities. Veronique, you raise your hand.
Yes, no, thanks. I just wanted to also come in on the question before on the need to, I mean, the kind of the question on the public and the private financing. Of course, the transition in that bigness or grandeur, as we say, can clearly not be funded by public funds, which is why these projects at some point they need to be privately funded. They need to be competitive and economic, and that's also one of the purposes of this target program that we have on our initiative, which is really about giving a helping hand to kickstart seeking for private investment. So it's really about trying to give guidance on the project preparations, guidance on the regions to develop project pipelines, certain feasibility studies or environmental impact assessment. But the grant will not come to finance the whole project. It's really just about kickstarting it to get private funding. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. One question that I think is coming from actually our organizers team here is that perhaps it's good, Veronique, if you were able to explain how regions have been joining the initiative, and what is the sort of like, we probably mostly have most of the regions already now, right? But they've been gradually joining, and then initially the initiative was only about coal, and then it expanded to what we call Coal Plus, which is peat and oil shale. There are also obviously the industrial and carbon intensive regions. So I think that's interesting, maybe to just shed some light on this, and maybe Natalia can also mention what is the sort of thematic scope, right? Is it specifically coal, lignite, or also other sort of carbon intensive activities or other careers?
Yeah. I mean, the initiative, which was set up in 2017, so it's only 5 years, but it seems like a long time ago, of course, was initially more restricted. It was really just focusing on coal as one of the most polluting energy sources in the EU. And it was voluntarily, let's say, regions when they were interested to engage in a coal phase out could join the initiative. And we set up what we called at that moment the country team. So there was really a dialogue from the Commission with these regions and various stakeholders to discuss how they wanted to go about this phase out and what kind of support they needed. But this has, I mean, as the narrative has been changing, and in the EU we have signed up for climate neutrality and so on. We have widened the scope to also include, as you just mentioned, peat and oil shale, but also the funding is also now going to carbon intensive regions, basically to identify the regions that are eligible. I mean, it depends a little bit on what kind of aspect you look at. The coal regions in transition initiative is open to all the regions that want to join. The workshops are open to everyone who wants to join online or physically. There's no restrictions whatsoever. We welcome everyone with open arms. Related to funding, of course, it's a different story, as there's only a certain amount of funding. That funding is available for for coal and carbon intensive regions. And there, the identification of the regions was a process between the European Commission, but also the member states and the regions to identify in which regions of which country are eligible for that funding.
Thank you. Talia, would you like to?
Yes, I can try to answer that. So I'm going to put another link in the chat. All right. So again, I default to the federal government in terms of how energy communities are defined in the United States. Well, energy communities is kind of an arbitrary name, right? But it's about how we prioritize the quote unquote transitioning communities in the US. And I have a confession to make. And that confession is that when I go out to Appalachian communities and even speak to local governments, I do not use the word just transition. It is, sometimes we say, when you say just transition, it's the invitation to a funeral. So I prefer the phrase economic diversification. How do we work with local leaders to diversify our economy, to ensure that we have alternate forms of investment? And so that gets really tricky, but it's working. I will say it's working, right? It's working. We have to talk about meeting people where they are. And for us, the whole communities, it's cultural. It's very much cultural. I mean, we have generations upon generations of West Virginians whose families have been working in the coal mines and are just very, very proud of that. And so a lot of what we do when you look at Reimagine Appalachia's material is to honor our culture and traditions around that. And so, the things that what I put in the chat is you can actually see, right? There's many different coal communities or energy communities from yes, the Gulf Coast and Texas to some of our other oil producing regions in Alaska. And so this is all the quantitative data, but we share a cultural bond as well that's more qualitative. And I think that's also, something that we need to talk about as well.
Thank you. I would like now to maybe offer you the last chance to say something in conclusion, but there is actually a nice bridge between what you said, Natalia, about just transition. We have actually a question, which, I mean, we didn't start with this because that could have been an hour-and-a-half debate, but basically, how do we know when the transition is just? And of course, you know, we know that the term comes from the US and it has so many interpretations and everybody claims theirs is right. I mean, we have formal ILO definition and this and that. And of course, sometimes we just use it as a sort of, just to say that we want to include all the political, socioeconomic and human factor and labor and economy and finance and everything, right? So maybe in your concluding remark, if you could just say, what is your interpretation of the term in your sort of in the practical terms in your daily work, and maybe just any reflection or any invitation to collaborate, because that's what I would like us to end this, that you know we have a body of knowledge that each of the presenters has, but the most important is that we shouldn't stop with this event. We want to continue and just have bilateral or collaboration in smaller groups, and maybe we'll also have a bit of more structured discussions in the coming 2 years about concrete examples and meeting with various officials and stakeholders. So I don't know, maybe we start with Maria and then Natalia and Veronique to conclude.
Okay, I would like to conclude as I began. We are miners, and this is very important because we are proud of being miners, and we must encourage that this transition is really just with the territories and with people, that nobody is left behind, and that we're accompanied by the European Union, of course, but also of other countries and other parts of the world. Because when we talk together, we see that we have many things in common, and being together, we can become a driving force again. So transition is necessary as a driving force, but also the collaboration and cooperation with people.
Thank you. Natalia, would you like to comment?
Yes. What is a just transition? Again, I go back to one of Reimagine Appalachia's strong pillars that appeals to everyone, and everyone I think would consider just, is making sure that any transition comes with good jobs, strong wages, ladders for advancement. And particularly, I think in the US and I would say most other places, a lot of these traditional positions in the fossil fuel industry have been employed by men. And so we're also looking to expand career opportunities for women and different classes and different races, particularly marginalized people. And so making it truly, truly inclusive and better than we had a century ago.
Amazing.
And thank you. Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. Yes, we'd look forward to collaborating further.
Thank you, Veronique.
As the last one, it's the hardest because I would agree with everything that has been said so far. Of course, a just transition, it's a green transition that should make sure that everyone is better off at the end, our environment, but also the people living in those environments. So it's a people-centered transition that doesn't forget about, let's say, the green, about the environment and less pollution and so on. And yes, of course, as I said before, our initiative is really has open arms, is welcoming everyone to join. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if for follow-up talk or.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to say that, we're trying to finish a few minutes before so that, you don't have to rush to your subsequent appointments. Just to say 24th, 26th of October, mark your calendars, come to Brussels in person or join us online. I think we will be in touch in sort of less formal way with some of you on the panel, but also with the participants. The recording will be shared on the DG Energy YouTube channel. I posted a link there, presentations as well. And maybe now, if people feel like, please post in the chat box one quick takeaway from this webinar, you know, something that inspired you, something that you started reflecting, you know, could be positive, could be also critical, but, you know, before you go, just type something like a goodbye message from what you've been listening and hearing in this webinar. And I think we just leave the link open for a couple more minutes, and then we conclude. And I want to thank you for your time, dear panelists, but above all, I want to thank all the participants, because nowadays, in this time when there's a sort of, we are returning to the physical events, it's not easy to attract large groups of people for Zoom, because I think we are all a bit tired. So thank you very much for being with us. I mean, we save some emissions, but yeah, there's no replacement for in-person interaction. So therefore, I think we are looking forward. I'm sure, Veronique, you share, you echo that, and Maria, to the in-person meeting after, I think the last one was in the fall of 2019 that we had in person as part of the initiative. So yeah, it's been a while. So I think everybody will be so happy to catch up in person in Brussels late October. So thanks again. Post your reflection, and I hope to see you in various occasions in the coming months and years. Thank you so much.